Well, I've got it written down because on this trip it was really like drinking from a fire hose. And then it's sort of like when you study one language, having studied another one, you forget the one you just studied when you learn the new one. It was a little bit like that for me, going from place to place to place. You felt like you were learning so much on one place, and then you move on to the next one and are getting all this other information. And Chet's a little bit better at retaining all of that than I am. But hopefully I'll be able to cover it. So let's go ahead. We've got a couple minutes, but we can probably go ahead and get started because we've got a lot to go through. We went on this trip, the footsteps of Paul and John, through pilgrim tours initially, and I have to apologize for this projector. It makes the pictures kind of washed out. This is in Kusadasi, and it was the very first place that we stayed. And this is the only time I'm showing you anything other than a biblical site. But this city is about 5 miles from ancient Ephesus. And this was on the water. Ancient Ephesus used to be a port city on the water. But because the river, it was at the mouth of a river, and because that port and the river had filled in so much with silt, it's now 5 miles from the water. And even at the time when it was there, they were dredging and doing things to try and keep the port open. So this is a picture of Ephesus from further away, and you can just see up here, see the stadium up there, and this is one of the main roads, the Marble Road, and that is the road that led to the harbor. So it's so far away in this picture, it's hard to see. And the temple of Artemis would have been down here. So, oh, wait a minute, no, I'm not. This is the main auditorium. There we go. This is the smaller auditorium. That's the bigger one. The temple of Artemis would have been out here. And so this is the entrance to the city. Sorry, I was turned around a little bit. So this is that Marble Road, and the road leading to the harbor was here. So the water would have been down here. Sorry, I'm turned around. All right. And this again shows, here we have, this is an what happened?
I got it.
It didn't let me go back. Well, you can see in the little picture where the harbor once was and the road to the harbor. Here we go. The road to the harbor is here, and there's the harbor. This is that big auditorium that we showed you. The smaller one is up here, and I'll show you another picture that includes it. This is the Agora, which is the area, the commercial area. And here's where the library is. You'll see all this. This is where the temple of Artemis was. So that's just to kind of give you an overview. Here it is again, but this time this is where the entrance is. Here's the road down into the commercial area. This was another agora up here. And agora is just essentially a place where it's almost like an ancient version of a mall, where they would have had shops or various things going on where people would have gathered. And I'll go into more detail as we go through. But this is the smaller auditorium that we'll see pictures of, and that's where they would have gathered for city, like political gatherings to decide city affairs. It's almost like their town hall, so to speak. They would have also had shows in here. It was a theater. There was a bath at the entrance, which you'll see the ruins of. This city had about 4 baths, public baths. People didn't have baths in their own home except for the very wealthy, so they would go to a public bath. And there were 4 here, but there was always one that was right at the entrance to the city, with the idea being that when you came into the city, you would stop first at the public bath to clean up so that you were able to be around people and be presentable. And they had in these public baths, I'm not going to be showing you detailed pictures of any of them, but in a lot of the ruins that we've seen, you can actually see the little heaters that were all under the floor there's still remains of the heaters that were under the floor for the hot room. They had first you'd walk in and there'd be like a locker room, a place where you could change clothes. And then you'd go into, there was a cold bath and a tepid bath and a hot bath. So they had 4 of those in Ephesus, and the main one would have been at the entrance. So this is the ruins of that bath of Varius, and it dates back to the 2nd century AD. Now, there was a row of columns. You see these columns here, and then the ones further back. They're all along here. You're going to see what looks like a road, and it's flanked by columns on either side. And the columns formed what was called a basilica. You've probably heard that term before, basilica. We think of that as meaning a church. And the way that word came to be used to refer to a church is that a church in a typical architectural design had the 2 rows of columns going down either side of the aisle with a roof overhead, and that it had the side aisles on either side. Well, a basilica in ancient times was really just a roofed colonnade, and it was here put up in order for theater goers, because you'll see, well, we're about to show it, but back in here, there's a place where this theater was, where they had different productions or they had city gatherings. And the basilica was designed to keep theater goers dry in the rain and also out of the heat of the sun. There it is again. You see the columns on either side of it. So that wasn't just a road with columns along it, it would have been roofed. And all along it would have been different, these are different buildings that were public buildings. Here's the theater. And you can see there's still marble on the seats. It would have been entirely white marble, but much of the marble is missing. And this theater is called the Odeon, and it's where city matters were discussed or performances held. This is the view from the Odeon, and this is what would have been another agora or place where people would have gathered for different events. There would have been not as much commercial in this one, but there was a temple of Isis back in here. But that's the view from the Odeon. We're going to skip a lot of these are some of the different buildings that were along the way. Okay, this is the view looking down. The road went along here. You can just see some people down at the bottom. And that road was the marble that would have been there when the apostles were in Ephesus. So it's an ancient road, and it's paved with white marble. But this is a view looking down. This is some covered homes that you'll see pictures of in a little bit, that are the homes of the very wealthy. There was a public bath and public toilet essentially right in here. And this was the library, which is it held more manuscripts than any other library in the world, and it's fully intact. But remember, a library back then was a place where they held a lot of scrolls. So there were just little niches in the wall where they put these scrolls.
They covered homes. You might mention
I'm going to go into more.
Yeah, it's because it's an active art.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, the reason it's covered like that right now, it's not what it looked like then. It's just that they are in the process of digging them out and doing that archaeological dig. This whole thing is in process. And you can see out here, that used to be water. So, and now it's all filled in and it's land. There's the road. That was the ancient marble road. That's the Memmius Monument. I'm not gonna spend time on that right now. It's a god, the marble carving of the goddess Nike. It would have decorated the top of one of the gates. This is the temple of, actually this is the fountain that's across from the temple of Domitian. Hold on, I'm going through here quickly. Domitian was one of the emperors, and there were a lot of different sites or buildings that were dedicated to different emperors. This was originally the fountain of Pollio, and one of the aqueducts would have brought water into this fountain from miles and miles away, and would have filled the fountain with water, and then the water would have been available for people to go and draw water. But the fountain of Pollio was later dedicated to Domitian, who was the son of Vespasius. And Domitian, we'll get into more of the different emperors in Rome, but Domitian was an evil emperor, and they had dedicated both the temple of Domitian, which is after this. This is the temple, and the fountain that was across from it to him. This is part of that temple, and these are the stairs leading up to it that are the original stairs. And when he died, because he had been such an evil emperor, the people went around and erased his name from all of the different places that it was carved in Ephesus, and they renamed the temple of Domitian back to the temple, or the fountain of Domitian to the fountain of Pollio. But because during the Roman period, Ephesus was second only to Rome, and so one of the ways that they essentially tipped their hat to Rome and remained in favor was to dedicate buildings to the different emperors, and that was one of the ones that they had done that.
Cynthia, was it basically an earthquake that caused the most destruction?
There was a huge earthquake that caused quite a bit of destruction, and then but then the other issue was that the people, because the harbor filled in, eventually it was an earthquake, it was conquering peoples coming in, but then it was also just that the harbor filled in and it was no longer a good place for the city to be. So as they moved away, then it went into ruins. And one of the things that you'll see in Rome is that when people were building new buildings, they would treat old ones as a quarry. And so one of the things that we saw here is sometimes they'd show us something and it would have originally been in another place and they had moved it. So there was a lot of that went on. These are just a sign of Christians having been in Ephesus. And we know that Ephesus was a place where, I'll tell you about this in a minute. Ephesus was the place first where John would have gone with Mary, Jesus's mother, and they lived there for a while, and there is evidence of them. There's a house that was attributed to Mary in Ephesus, kind of up in the hills, but that's sort of sketchy, the connection. They aren't really sure that was actually Mary's house, but they have found a cave that has frescoes on the walls that date back to biblical times, and they see mention both of John and also of Paul in that cave. But we weren't allowed to go see it. They no longer allow tourists in because they're concerned about the frescoes being damaged. So it's not a site that we can go to. This is a fountain that was dedicated to Emperor Trajan. It's called Trajan's Fountain. And it's another one where an aqueduct would have brought water into the fountain. And it used to have up at the top, where right in here, it had a huge statue of Trajan, and he was essentially standing on the circle that is meant to represent the world, but only his foot is left and the circle. but it would have been right in here, and there was an upper fountain and then a lower fountain, and water would have come cascading down. It would have been quite the spectacle, and people would have come here to gather water. So these are the terraced houses. And these were the homes of the very wealthy. You can see how they've got pieces laid out here, that they're still in the process of putting back together like a puzzle. But they had frescoes on the wall, they had marble on the walls and on the floor. You can see here there's a mosaic of a lion and the paintings on the wall. It was all very elaborate. But again, these were the homes of the wealthy, and it's a number of different homes in here. I want to say there were 7 different homes in this group that are ranging from 1,000 square feet to 6,000 square feet per home. And one of the things that you can't really tell that well in here, but people didn't have windows that went to the outside because they wanted to be protected from thieves coming in to rob them. So the windows all entered into the central courtyard. And the central courtyard would have had an opening in the roof where you could get light, and also where the rain would come in, and they would have a fountain or a pool of some kind to collect that rain when it came in. This is when we came out of the terraced houses. This is the view, looking down the road to, this is where, if you go down here, this down here was the road to the harbor. Up here was that great amphitheater, and way down there would have been the Temple of Artemis. That's the library. And the library was also essentially a monument. Let me find it, I'm getting ahead of myself with my notes. I'm going into this in much more detail in the Bible study. We're gonna do each of these sites in detail. This is the Celsius Library. And it was completed in 135 AD, so this would not have been there during the time of the disciples. But it was in honor of the Roman governor of Asia, Gaius Julius Celsus Ptolemeus, by his son. So the library stood then in a similar condition to what it is now, and it contained 12,000 scrolls. And in all likelihood, the sarcophagus of his father would have been within the library. This double gate beside it, do you see that right here? I'm going to show you another picture. That double gate led into the commercial agora. And this double gate was something that was built by two freed slaves, Masius and Mithridates. And they would have been, they built this as a way of saying, of gratitude, of expressing their gratitude for having been freed. And it led into the agora. And it was at the time street level, but the floor's been raised up because they had a problem with water going through the gates and flooding the agora. But in all likelihood, it was also a monument for each of them. They probably were buried in one of the side alcoves in this monument. So this is the road that is down to the main theater. I believe it was called the Marble Road. Is that right, Chet? Do you remember? I've got it in my notes. I'm just trying to go too fast. Okay. But you can see again the columns that are around this road goes down here. The road to the harbor was there, and then there was a road along here. And it would have created, on 4 sides, it was colonnaded all the way around. At one point, it was 2 stories tall and had a roof, of course, over the columns. Anytime you see columns, there was a roof there. But at one time, it was 2 stories tall, and needless to say, the first earthquake would have taken that down. But these were all shops in here. And the same with along the side that is over here. And so when the Apostle Paul came to Ephesus, he came with Priscilla and Aquila. I don't know if you remember those names from the Bible, but he originally met them in Corinth. So we're out of order for Paul's travels. He would have gone from Athens to Corinth to Ephesus. And he met Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. In 49 AD, the Jews were expelled from Rome. And because there was a complaint that the emperor felt that they were creating too much commotion, because what was happening is the Christians were preaching Christ and the Jews were getting upset about it. And so the Jews were reacting against the Christians preaching, and all of the Jews were expelled from Rome in about 49 AD. And it may have been that the Jewish Christians were also expelled, and only the Gentile Christians were left, which is in all probability what happened. But Priscilla and Aquila were expelled from Rome, and Paul met them in Corinth. And then they came with him to Ephesus, and they would have spent time in this agora as tent makers. They would have had their own shop. Some of the shops, they might have lived above them. And this is also where he had the run-in with the silversmiths. You can see how over here was the other side of the agora, and also the road down to the harbor. They ran into trouble with the silversmiths because the silversmiths were the ones who made the idols. They made the images of Artemis and for the temple of Artemis. So they had quite a trade going. They made a lot of money. And when Paul began preaching Christ and preaching against idol worship and against this worship of things made with hands, their trade dropped off. And so they were trying to run Paul out of town so that they could keep their trade going. And that began here. And then this is looking back again at the gates and the library, so you can see where the shops were along here. It began here, and then the city gathered to deal with this issue, and they were trying to whip up trouble in this major amphitheater. The amphitheater originally was much taller than this, but it had to be lowered. The top seats were lost when they were bringing in the aqueduct, because the aqueduct had to go across the top of the amphitheater. But the amphitheater, again, would have been entirely covered with white marble. And the stage down here was able to be filled with water so that they could sing water scenes or naval events even. But when the silversmiths were trying to whip up trouble against Paul, let me find where that was, the name of the person, one of the leaders in the city came against them and basically said, this is not a matter that we need to be dealing with in the city, and brought an end to it. But you can see from here, there's the road to the harbor.
How are they here?
Well, it's an amphitheater, so the sound travels up. When Chet and I were first married, we lived in a little tiny house at the top of a hill right above a very busy street. And the sound, as it would come up the hill, amplified. So it was almost louder at the top of the hill than it was if you were down on the street. And that's the same as is true here. The sound would have gotten louder. And the most important people would have sat down close to the front. And the higher up you got, you'd have more common people up there.
Yeah.
this is where the Temple of Artemis was. And you can see all that's left now is one column. What happened with the Temple of Artemis, when they built it, it was one of the 7 wonders of the world. But it was built on marshy ground in order to protect it from earthquakes. So the earthquake was not what did in the Temple of Artemis. There were a couple of things. There was a man who, I believe his name was Herodias, and I've gotten so far from my notes, who burned it because he wanted to be famous. And it had a wooden roof at the time, and he burned the temple and did become famous, but everybody in Ephesus promised that they weren't going to put his name in any records or repeat his name because they wanted to not have his wishes be fulfilled, but eventually his name got out. So he burned it, and they did try and rebuild it, but eventually what happened is just that the marshland overtook it. And when they finally did the excavation, they had archaeologists from London come in and do an excavation. And they found the floor of the temple about 6 meters down. So it had sunk quite a ways down. And now all that's left of it is the one column. So this is on our way to Patmos. That island in the distance is Patmos. We went from Ephesus to Patmos to see where John wrote the book of Revelation. And I had always pictured Patmos a little bit like Alcatraz or something, you know, like this desert island. But it was actually quite beautiful. And what happened in 94, I'm switching back to John. So in 94 AD, John was exiled to Patmos. He had essentially Domitian, who was the emperor at that time, the evil emperor that we mentioned in Ephesus, tried to, because John had been preaching the gospel and Domitian was notorious for persecuting the Christians, he tried to kill John by putting him in a vat of burning oil. And this is something that's possibly legend. I mean, it's attributed to legend more than it is history, but he survived. And so since he couldn't kill him, he sent him to Patmos. And Patmos was where they sent criminals and political, both regular criminals and also political criminals. And they would live here anywhere on the island. They weren't given food and shelter and that kind of thing. They were just sent to the island. And there were Roman guards to make sure that they didn't escape, but they had to just stay on the island and fend for themselves. So many of them, as you might imagine, died of exposure, some died of hunger. John, it's believed, had someone staying with him that would have been essentially one of his disciples that would have been caring for him, serving him, and serving as a scribe. And this walkway, we're coming up a walk here, and these are just views from the walk. That's looking down at the harbor where we came in. This walkway goes up to this building that's been built next to and sort of around the cave where John would have stayed. And so caves or makeshift shelters were how people would have survived if they were sent to Patmos.
Cynthia, there
Yes.
were copper mines there also. Did they send some people to work at copper mines too?
I don't know. You may know more than I do on that.
I know
Sounds
that
like you
John, well, from what I've heard, John actually did work there at the mines. But
He was older by that time, so maybe that's why, but I don't know. That's good to know. I'll check into it. So this is essentially just walking into the area that was right next to, and that's just a poster of John that's an icon. This is the view from the cave. We were not allowed to take pictures of the cave itself. We often ran into that just because they, I don't know, we weren't allowed to take pictures in the cave. So, but that's what his view was. And I mean, the cave was a cave, and they pointed out things like a rock where they thought he rested his head, and you know, things that were just sort of a way of embellishing the story a little bit. This is an icon of the Apostle John holding Okay, on to Corinth. Corinth was right on this right by this isthmus of land between the Gulf of Corinth and the Saronic Gulf. And,
Which essentially is separating the Adriatic from the Aegean.
yes, thank you. And and Athens was over here. And in order for people to get around this was is it the Peloponnese Peninsula?
Yeah.
The Peloponnese Peninsula was on the southern end of Greece. This is all Greece up here. So in order to get from this part of Greece over to this part of Greece, and also for merchants at that time liked to travel by sea. Greece was very hilly, very mountainous, and so it was very difficult to go over land. And they were also traveling from one country to another when they were going, say, from Spain to Phoenicia or from Carthage to Egypt and Italy. They would have to go around the Peloponnese Peninsula, and there were two capes that made it especially dangerous. It wasn't only 700 kilometers longer, but it was also extremely dangerous to go around those two capes. So they found that it was much safer and much shorter to cut across this little isthmus. And they built a road that was, this went back to, I want to say like 7 BC. It may have been more like, I think that's right. But they built a road made out of very hard limestone that went across that isthmus. And it would have been it was at the narrowest point, and it was 6.4 kilometers wide, which is, how many miles is that? Anybody good at quick? It's not, if
That's good.
6 kilometers is 10 miles,
About
so,
4 miles.
yeah, about 4 miles. So, but the road was built of hard limestone, and it's unclear whether they dragged the ships across it. In more likelihood, they put it on some kind of wheels.
Didn't they have, I bet it's with the Corinth Canal.
Yeah, we're gonna see pictures of the canal. They did eventually cut the canal, but at the time of Paul, they didn't have the canal. And so Corinth at that time, because this was a major pass-through for different ships, merchants coming through, Corinth was this major center for trade. It would have also been a major center for sailors coming through. So you can get an idea of what Corinth might have been like there. They did eventually cut this canal. It was started under Nero, and he got about 700 meters in, but Nero then suddenly died. He committed suicide. And so they stopped the project, and it took another 1,800 years before it was realized in 1893. But essentially, when they did finally build this canal, they made it too narrow for major ships, so only smaller boats can go through. Today, it's really just a tourist attraction. Okay, so this you can see is the entrance. We were in, which side did we say this was on? We just talked about this last night. It was, I think it was on, this was on the Gulf of Corinth side. But you can see there's the road, the remains of the road. And that's what they would have dragged the ships on. And they don't know really what they put them on, or whether they used animals to drag them or just men. It's all just guesswork. Okay, so here we are in Corinth, and the archaeological site here was not as developed as the one in Ephesus. But Corinth would have been a major city at that time. It was actually the Roman capital of that province. You can see in the background, this is the Temple of Apollo. And there was also, I don't know that if they had found it, this is the Temple of Apollo. But there was also a temple dedicated to Aphrodite here. And the Temple of Aphrodite had about 1,000 slaves that were temple prostitutes. And so it was like a brothel for all these sailors coming through. And Corinth was notorious for being for being a place with some really bad habits. Let's just put it that way. And so this is where Paul was doing ministry, and this was the agora right here, and that would have been a shop, and it was 2 stories tall. The top would have been where someone would have lived, and the bottom would have been the shop. This was at one point when Paul was in Corinth, and again, this is where he met Priscilla and Aquila, and so they would have done tent making together. He was he had been preaching mostly in synagogues in Ephesus, but also preaching in the agora. And when he left Ephesus, he felt like he wasn't going to preach in synagogues anymore because he had difficulty there with the Jews, but he ended up preaching in synagogues again here too. And this was, oh, wait a minute. Oh, wait. There we go. This was the judgment seat that is spoken of in Acts 18, 1-18, and I don't have time to read it all now. It talks about Paul it was when Gallio was proconsul, and the Jews were making attacks on Paul, and they brought him to the place of judgment. And he was trying to they were trying to persuade the leadership to make Paul leave, and they didn't do it. But this would have been the place of judgment where he was tried, and it was in the agora. This is a fountain. It's called the Pyrene Fountain. Another picture of the fountain. These were headless statues. This is in the museum at Corinth, and Rome at the time made their statues with detachable heads. So often you'll see Roman statues with essentially what looks like a crack. And the Romans were really good at recycling. And so they made statues with detachable heads so that when somebody fell out of favor or was no longer in government, they would just remove the head and put somebody else's head on. And the bodies were typically essentially the ideal man or woman dressed in a toga. So, the person could have been less than ideal in body, but the way they were identified was their head. So a lot of the statues that we find now are headless because, since they were detachable, when an earthquake came, what fell off? The head, right? They also had all of these body parts shown, and they were body parts, organs, you name it, all kinds of body parts. And the reason for these body parts is because they had a temple next to the temple of Apollo. His son in mythology was Asclepius, and the Asclepion was a temple to Asclepius where it was a place of healing. It would have had a fountain. There was a spring that came up there. The air was really pure because of the location of it. The winds would have cleared the air, and there would have been buildings for restaurants and places to rest and recuperate. But anyway, people, when they were sick or if they had something wrong, they would bring a clay statue or representation of that body part as an offering, essentially. And that's why there are so many of these here, because of that temple. You can see some of the heads that I don't know if those heads were people if they had problems with their head or if they were heads from the statues. Now we are in Athens. And this is the stairway going up to the Acropolis. And it was a long stairway, but it wasn't steep. That is looking up at the temple of Nike, who's the goddess of victory. This was, well, let me get to my notes here. This was an Odeon that was built, an amphitheater essentially that was built much later. Where am I? Here it is. This is the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. And it's a stone Roman theater on the southwest slope of the Acropolis. It wasn't completed until AD 161, and it was renovated in 1950. So it's not just that it had, that it stayed so perfect. They use it today. They renovated it, and they use it for concerts. When we saw it, you can see it was set up with these backdrops for a concert, and they had the symphony preparing down here. But you can also see out here is Athens, and the water, the bay or the harbor is right there. So you're looking out on that harbor. And here we are, there's Chet. We're walking up to the Acropolis. We're standing on the Acropolis looking down, that's Mars Hill. And we're gonna talk about that in a minute. But you can see Athens surrounds the Acropolis. So it's this ancient site that's surrounded by the modern city. So that's another picture of the temple of Nike, or the goddess of victory.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is looking up at what was called the Propylaea, and it was basically a monumental ceremonial gateway that took you into the Acropolis. And it was in the process of being restored. And that's coming through it from the other side. That, of course, is the Parthenon. And one thing that you heard all the guides talking about was that the Parthenon, when they were working to restore it at an earlier point, the archaeologist was from London. And he actually, in the process of restoring it, took a lot of the statuary from inside it or even on it back to London and put it in the museum in London. So essentially, as the Greeks tell the story, stole the statuary. Now, he was being paid to do this work, or actually I think London was actually, might have been financing a lot of this work. But the way the Greeks remember the story is that he stole all that statuary and took it to London, and now it's been stripped. And but it's still in the process of being restored. This is an example of what the statuary would have looked like. This would have been on this part. But these are obviously copies that are, we went to the museum afterwards that showed different examples of fully restored models of the different buildings that we saw. This is called the Erechtheion, and it had these female statues that were huge, that were called the Caryatids, and it was, the Parthenon was dedicated to the goddess Athena and would have had a monster statue of Athena in it that was made at one point of pure gold. The Caryatids and the Propylaea, and the Erechtheion served as the cult of Poseidon. And so it was another temple that was up here. And you can see this is the other side of it, and this too is a major archaeological site. There's all kinds of work continuing to go on. So if you go to see these sites at a later point, it will be further restored. This is the stairway up to Mars Hill. And Mars Hill is where the government, or where people would have met. At one point, it was where people would have met to hear cases. It was, Mars is of course the Roman name for the god Ares, and so it's also called the Areopagus. Ares was the Greek name. But Ares was the god of war, and according to mythology, this is the hill where Ares came before all the other gods to be tried for the crime of killing Poseidon's son. So then the Greeks would use this as a place to hear cases. It was where their court was held. It was a court for civil, criminal, and also talking about religious matters. And so by the time Paul came here, it was less of a court location and more just a place where philosophy and religion and law were discussed, because the Greeks were interested in learning about everything. And so remember, when Paul came into Athens, he saw all these temples to so many different gods. And then he also saw the altar to the unknown God. So the Greeks, and he talked about how they were such a religious people that they even had made a combination for the God that they don't know. And he started teaching about the unknown God. Well, all that happened on Mars Hill. And this is standing on top of Mars Hill, looking out at the city. This is the view down here. You can see that was the agora, the commercial agora for Athens. So it's also part of the ancient site being displayed today. This is looking back at the Acropolis from Mars Hill. And this is just looking up at the Acropolis, just to give you an idea of what was blooming. This is the acanthus plant, which was used in Corinthian columns at the top. Acanthus was everywhere. This is another stadium that we saw in Athens that we didn't actually go into. That picture was taken from the bus. More just Athens in bloom. I couldn't resist throwing a few of these in. So this is Rome. We're now entering Rome, and I've got about 5 minutes to do Rome. These maritime pines that look like giant umbrellas were everywhere. This is the ancient wall around Rome that we saw as we came into Rome. These were ancient stairs that are marble under the wood that had been brought by Constantine's mother from Jerusalem, and people are only allowed to go up on their knees. This was the Basilica of St. John, and this is one of the oldest churches in Rome. That was
in all the world, right?
Yes, thank you, in all the world. The oldest basilica in the whole world. And those are the keys of Peter, of course, that Jesus gave to Peter. Each of the basilicas had an ancient door that was only opened once a year by the Pope. Only when the Pope came was that door opened. And there were statues of, this is Thaddeus, but many of the basilicas had statues of the different apostles and in some way representing in the statue how they were martyred. And this is the altar, but it's also often where they had the remains of different apostles. Okay, this is the Colosseum, and I wanted you to see this because the Colosseum was the site of the Roman Games, and we are so out of time. But it was built largely, it was built of white marble, tufa, which is essentially volcanic rock, and also concrete. And while this was used as a quarry for a long period of time, when it was no longer in use as a Colosseum, in other words, people stole the marble and took it and used it for other things. Now they're restoring it, and much of it remains because the concrete and tufa remain. each of the there were many gates here because this could hold about 70,000 people. And this was built for the people to be able to be entertained. But you can see the number at the top of the gate. You went into a particular gate based on where you were seated. And this was one of the ways of establishing the social hierarchy in Rome, because the elite would walk through different hallways and different gates from the general public. And you can see this is essentially the remains of the nosebleed section. This was the floor, and it would have gone up higher than this, and they had awnings that would go across the top to protect people from the rain and the sun, and the sailors were employed in having those awnings go in and out. And you can see all the different, this would have all been under the floor, and they were places for everything from scenery to be kept, if it was a production that had scenery. They had lifts that could bring up scenery or could bring up animals or people in a dramatic way. It was also where the gladiators battled each other and where Christians were martyred. There were battles of animals against people, and some of them were people that were prepared to battle the animals, and some of them were Christians essentially being martyred. And this is where the emperor would have sat, and the most important people. The Senate would have had some of these lower seats. If there were animals in the arena, they would have had cages to contain them. And they also had archers at different points to keep the animals from getting to the people. This is the Colosseum at night. And the Colosseum was built, Nero was a very unpopular emperor, and Nero was one of the ones who really persecuted Christians horribly. And Nero's palace was on this side, and there was a golden statue, an immense golden statue of Nero on the other side that isn't there anymore. But when Vespasian became emperor, he had been one of Nero's generals and had a more humble beginning. And so when he became emperor, this had been a lake, a man-made lake that Nero's palace overlooked. And Vespasian came in, filled in the lake, and built this place for public entertainment on that site so that everyone could come and be entertained for free. So it was open to everyone and free seating for everyone. Not necessarily the same seats, but it was all free. And we're really out of time. I'm gonna have to stop. So that's the Arch of Constantine. There's so much more, and I apologize. The Bible study on Wednesday, both at 9 o'clock and also at 10:45, are going to look at Rome in more detail. So men or women, if you're able to come, you're welcome to join us for Rome in detail this Wednesday. Thank you all.